The night my husband told me I wasn't presentable enough to attend the ceremony for the company I had spent 11 years helping him build. He said it while fixing the cufflinks I bought him with money we only had because I knew how to stretch a crisis into survival. That is what I remember first. Not the insult itself. The cufflinks. Silver. Rectangular. Understated. The kind of thing rich men wear when they want other rich men to notice they've become careful with taste. I bought them 3 Christmases ago after our first profitable quarter. When Grant still used to kiss my forehead in the kitchen and say things like, "We made it through because you never panic before I do." Back then, he still said, "we." By the time he looked at me in our bedroom mirror and told me I shouldn't come to his founder recognition gala because I didn't really fit the image anymore. That we had been dead for at least a year. He just hadn't buried it in public until that moment. I was standing near the bed in a navy dress I'd pressed myself that afternoon. One hand still on the garment bag I had just unzipped. Staring at the man whose speeches I had written. Whose investor decks I had corrected. Whose payroll crises I had quietly solved by refinancing my own inherited condo before we were even married. Grant didn't say it cruelly at first. That was his style. Men like him almost never begin with the knife. They begin with concern. Softness. Regret arranged so carefully it almost insults you more than open contempt would. He adjusted one cuff, glanced at me through the mirror, and said, "Selene, I think tonight is probably not the right setting for you." I remember blinking. Just once. Because even after everything, some part of me still expected decency to arrive before humiliation. "What does that mean?" I asked. He sighed. Actually sighed. Like I was making something simple difficult. "The board crowd is going to be there. Press. Donors. New partners. Daphne thinks." He stopped himself too late. "Daphne. Of course. Daphne Voss. Head of Communications. 32. Immaculate. Bright-toothed. Camera ready. And very suddenly attached to all the optics surrounding Grant Holloway's transformation from scrappy founder to visionary CEO. Daphne. Who had been calling more often? Staying later. Touching his elbow in photos as if proximity itself were part of her job description. Daphne. Who kept saying things in meetings like, "Grant's story really resonates when it feels aspirational." Aspirational. I should have known then what kind of woman translated wives into liabilities. I set the garment bag down slowly. "Daphne thinks what?" Grant turned around. That was when he finally said it cleanly. "I just don't think you're presentable enough for this kind of room anymore." There are sentences that split your life into before and after. That was one of them. Not because he called me ugly. He wasn't stupid enough for something that easy to quote later. No. He chose something worse. Presentable. A word with layers. Plausible deniability built into every syllable. It could mean clothes. Weight. Hair. Energy. Age. Style. Confidence. Whatever hurt most. The listener could supply herself. And the speaker could later pretend she had misunderstood. But I understood perfectly. I understood that I had spent 11 years in the background of his success, becoming useful in all the unphotographed ways. Solving. Editing. Smoothing. Absorbing. Advising. Making impossible months survivable and survivable months look strategic. I understood that he had become rich enough to start resenting the evidence of who stood beside him when he was still frightened. I understood that the very woman who built the foundation often becomes visually inconvenient once the house starts attracting guests. He kept talking. That was his second mistake. "It's not an attack," he said. "You know how branding works. The company's in a different place now. Branding. There it was. Not marriage. Not gratitude. Not history. Branding." I looked at him in the tuxedo I had once steamed for investor dinners in apartments with bad lighting and unpaid electric bills. I looked at the polished shoes. The tailored jacket. The watch I bought him when his first acquisition closed. The man-shaped version of a future I had helped construct from raw fear and private labor. And for one terrible second, I saw it from the outside. He really believed he had made himself. That was the part that stung deepest. Not that he was ashamed of me. That he had become so dependent on the edited version of his own story that he needed me out of frame to keep believing it. I should tell you, I cried. I didn't. I did something that confused him far more. I got very still. Because the moment he said presentable, every conversation I'd been half hearing for months suddenly arranged itself into a pattern. The late-night strategy calls with Daphne. The way my name had quietly disappeared from thank you remarks. The draft biography on the Foundation website that described Grant as self-built, the gala invitation addressed to him alone. Even though the original recognition nomination had gone in under paperwork I had helped prepare with Leonard Pike, our outside counsel, I had not been cut out all at once. I had been professionally airbrushed. And now, standing in the room where I had laid out his tie and ironed the shirt he no longer deserved to wear, I realized something almost cold enough to count as peace. If I was no longer presentable enough to attend the ceremony, then he had forgotten exactly who made the ceremony possible. He picked up his phone, probably expecting me to break then, to plead, to accuse, to ask whether Daphne would be there, to make myself small enough for him to feel justified and large enough for him to feel desired. Instead, I looked him in the eye and said, "Then you should go alone." That was when his face changed. Just a little, because he had expected pain. What he saw instead was recognition. And somewhere beneath the tailored calm he had been wearing all evening, my husband began to understand that he might have just excluded the one woman in the room who knew where every buried foundation was. The truth is, Grant Holloway did not build his company alone. He built his myth alone. That was the difference. The company Holloway Therapeutics, which later rebranded itself into the cleaner, more expensive sounding, Holloway Biosystems, had been assembled the way most real companies are assembled, through panic, unpaid labor, bad coffee, improvised courage, half-broken software, and one person in the room quietly doing 3 invisible jobs while the visionary talks to investors. That quiet person was me. Not in the way wives say it sometimes. Bitterly but vaguely I supported him. No. I mean, in the literal sense. I wrote the first hiring policies. I negotiated the lease on the first warehouse office because Grant's credit was too thin and his confidence too loud. I handled 2 payroll crises by moving money through my own account before the receivables came in. I rewrote investor decks at 2 in the morning because Grant liked ideas more than numbers, and men with money tend to notice when the numbers look like fiction. I also cooked, cleaned, answered emails when he was drunk on optimism or tired from his own theater, took calls from suppliers who preferred speaking to someone reasonable, managed his mother when she came through the office, acting like she was visiting a son already famous, carried half the emotional climate of his ambition on my back while pretending it was natural to be both wife and shock absorber. That is how companies get built by couples. One person gets called visionary. The other becomes infrastructure. For the first 3 years, I didn't mind. That part embarrasses me now. But honesty is better than dignity at this stage. I loved him. Or thought love meant believing hard enough in another person that your own exhaustion becomes irrelevant. Grant was magnetic then, in the way uncertain men often are, before success gives their vanity a permanent address. He could pitch. God. He could pitch. He could stand in a bad blazer under fluorescent lights and make a half-finished prototype sound like destiny. People wanted to believe him because he wanted to believe himself. I handled what belief couldn't. When he forgot regulatory language, I learned it. When the first lab manager quit, I interviewed replacements between pharmacy runs and bank meetings. When he wanted to take a dangerous convertible note because the investor felt right, I stayed up until dawn reading terms and found the dilution trap hiding in paragraph 14. When he promised impossible timelines, I was the one who stayed behind, explaining them back into reality. Grant used to know that. He used to say things like, "I'd be nowhere without Selene," That line disappeared long before I did. The shift began once the company stopped needing obvious rescue and started needing image. That is the stage where a lot of men break morally. Not during the struggle. During refinement. Once the office gets glass walls and the logos become cleaner and the photographers start arriving and the board wants confidence. Not chaos. Suddenly the wife who handled the ugly years begins to look like evidence. Evidence of the cramped apartment, the unpaid invoices, the budget grocery lists. The woman in old sweatpants carrying boxed files into a sublease office while her husband rehearsed confidence in the bathroom mirror. By year 7, Grant no longer wanted evidence. He wanted narrative. He hired Daphne Voss in year 8. Officially, she was there to professionalize investor relations and sharpen the company's public profile. Unofficially, she was there to translate history into something more flattering. She had that polished executive-adjacent beauty that made men sit up straighter and women instantly understand the room had gained an instrument. Not a colleague. Smooth voice. Strategic warmth. The kind of face that always looked expensive but forgettable in the right way. So powerful men could project their preferred version of themselves onto it. I disliked her immediately. Not because she was beautiful. Because she understood too quickly which parts of the company had no formal title but all the memory. Me. She never challenged me directly at first. Smart women rarely do. She asked little questions instead. Did Grant always want this brand to feel so founder-forward? Who handles the old investor correspondence archive? Do we know whether the early deck language was ever professionally cleaned up? Professionally cleaned up. As if 11 years of my work had been one long draft awaiting someone presentable enough to bless it. And slowly, little things began disappearing. My name from internal acknowledgments. My quotes from the anniversary booklet draft. The sentence in Grant's founder bio that originally read, "With early operational support from his wife, Selene Mercer." Holloway survived its most precarious first years. That became, Grant navigated the company through its precarious first years with unusual resilience and clarity. Unusual resilience and clarity. I remember reading that line on a proof sheet in Daphne's office and understanding, all at once, what kind of editing was underway. Not copy editing. Erasure. By year 10, the board had started treating me like a spouse instead of a builder. Polite smiles at holiday dinners. Little comments about how proud you must be. One woman actually asked whether I'd always been more comfortable behind the scenes. And I smiled so hard my face hurt, because the truthful answer, no. You people pushed me there. Once the company was rich enough to be embarrassed by labor that looked female would have ruined dessert. Grant said nothing. That was the real betrayal. Not Daphne's ambition. Not the board's lazy sexism. His silence. He wore suits now that I never would have let him buy in year 2. He used language like scale and narrative alignment and market confidence, as if they had not all been dragged into existence through years when I was still the one proofreading term sheets with a baby monitor app open on my phone for the sister's child because their whole family used to treat my competence like public utility. And little by little, he stopped introducing me with context. Then stopped introducing me at all, unless someone forced it. Then, eventually, arrived at the mirror in our bedroom and informed the woman who had spent 11 years building his success that she was no longer presentable enough to witness its celebration. That's the thing about being quietly erased for long enough. By the time the insult arrives out loud, part of you is already done being surprised. The real humiliation happened 40 minutes later. Not in our bedroom. Not in the mirror. Not even in the sentence "not presentable enough." Vicious as that was. No. The true insult arrived when I opened the Gala livestream on my phone and watched another woman standing where I had stood for 11 years. That was the moment it crossed from cruelty into desecration. Grant left the house at 6:42 p.m. Without looking back, I heard the engine pull down the drive. The tires roll over the crushed gravel at the gate. And then the house went quiet in that strange, suspended way large homes do when someone has taken their appetite out into the night. I stayed where I was for a while. Then I took off the navy dress. folded it carefully, hung it back in the garment bag, and sat in the dark at the edge of the bed until the fury in my chest became orderly enough to use. At Shapte, Noah's Prezice. June Mercer texted me. My mother never wastes words. Especially not when she is trying not to interfere too quickly in something she believes her daughter should first see clearly for herself. Have you left yet? 3 dots appeared before I could answer. Then another message. Leonard says the event page is live. That was all. No sympathy. No outrage. Just a line to the evidence. I went downstairs, poured a glass of water I didn't drink, and opened the company's event feed. The gala was being held at the Saint Antoine, Clare Conservatory. The kind of glass and stone venue people rent when they want success to look botanical and inevitable. The main hall had been washed in gold light. There were suspended orchids over the stage. A black step and repeat backdrop with the new Holloway Biosystems logo in silver. And just enough camera coverage to make every smile strategic. Grant was already there. And so was Daphne. Of course she was. Not tucked off to the side with the communications team, not holding a clipboard in the back where women who actually do the work are expected to stand when the men they package start receiving applause. No. Daphne Voss was on Grant's arm. On his arm. In a champagne-colored gown that cost more than our first month's office rent 11 years ago. Standing at the entrance arch like she had always been part of the picture, and I had simply blurred out. I stared at the screen so hard my hand went numb around the phone, because there are betrayals you anticipate in outline. And then there are betrayals that still manage to arrive with fresh nerve. He hadn't merely excluded me. He had replaced me in public before the night had even begun. The live stream cut to a wider angle. Board members. Investors. Donors. Press. Leonard Pike near the entrance in a dark suit. Expression unreadable from a distance. 2 people from our earliest financing round men who had once sat at my kitchen table eating reheated lasagna while I walked them through a revised cost forecast because Grant had gone silent the moment real questions began. They were smiling now. Clinking glasses? As Daphne leaned in toward Grant and said something that made him laugh with his whole face. That laugh nearly finished me. Because it was the old one. The laugh from year 2. Year 3. Back when he still came home at midnight smelling like cheap coffee and adrenaline and pulled me into the kitchen because he couldn't believe we were actually doing this. We. He had moved from we to I so slowly I had almost let myself believe the pronouns were cosmetic. They weren't. They were architecture. The feed cut again. This time to the printed founder retrospective, looping on the side screens. A glossy visual timeline. Grant in the first warehouse. Grant at the first conference. Grant shaking hands with investors. Grant at the Series A close. Grant in a lab coat he barely wore long enough to understand where the sterile gowns were stored. And beneath the title card, From Vision to Industry Leader, the Grant Holloway story. Not Holloway and Mercer. Not early team. Not founding household. The Grant Holloway story. I felt my face go cold. Then came the panel slide. Founding support and acknowledgements. A list of executives, advisors, board chairs, legal counsel, communications, leadership. Daphne's name was on it. Mine was not. That was the humiliation beyond the insult. He hadn't just told me not to come because I was no longer presentable enough. He had already prepared the room to function as if I had never belonged there at all. I zoomed in on the screen and saw it more clearly than I wanted to. Special recognition. Daphne Voss. For shaping the modern voice of Holloway Biosystems. Modern voice. I laughed then. Not because anything was funny. Because my body briefly mistook disgust for humor just to stay upright. The modern voice of a company whose first loan bridge I secured by refinancing inherited property after Grant's first backer pulled out. The modern voice of a company whose original hiring manual I wrote on a folding table in a leased office with bad heat. The modern voice of a company I had kept solvent long enough for people like Daphne to later arrive and speak in polished nouns about brand evolution. My phone buzzed. Leonard Pike. I answered on the second ring. He didn't waste time. Selene. he said. And there was something in his voice I had not heard before. Not pity. Exactly. But the strain of a man who had just realized a quiet wrong had been made visually public. Did you know your name was removed from the founder acknowledgement deck? There it was. Not imagined. Not emotional. Not marital interpretation. Documented? No, I said. He exhaled once. Then you should know something else. The original deck still has your authorship metadata embedded. That landed like a bell. Because, in one sentence, Leonard gave me what Grant had spent years hoping I would forget. Proof. Not memory. Not sacrifice. Not wife logic. Authorship. I looked back at the screen. Grant and Daphne were moving toward the stage now. All gold, light, and applause, and curated inevitability. And for the first time since he told me I wasn't presentable enough to attend, I understood the scale correctly. He had not excluded me from a party. He had attempted to erase me from origin. And that, more than the dress, more than Daphne's hand on his arm, more than the founder's story swallowing 11 years of my work, was the insult that made everything after it very simple. I did not drive to the gala, screaming. That mattered. Because the first instinct after a public-private humiliation like that is always motion. Confront. Show up. Catch them in the light. Force the room to look at what it is pretending not to know. And if I had been a different kind of woman, or even the same woman, 5 years earlier, I might have done exactly that. I might have put the navy dress back on, fixed my mouth into something sharp enough to pass for composure, and walked into the St. Clair Conservatory on pure rage. That would have been satisfying for maybe 3 minutes. Then Daphne would have framed me as unstable. Grant would have looked pained. The board would have shifted into that dreadful upper-tier mode where men's ambition becomes complex and women's injury becomes unfortunate timing. No, they were not getting my pain live. They had already taken too much on the assumption that I would always pay emotionally first and think strategically later. So I sat at the kitchen table with the live stream still running on mute. Leonard Pike, on speakerphone. And 11 years of invisible labor finally arranging itself into something colder and more useful than heartbreak. Send me everything, I said. Leonard was quiet for a beat. Not because he was surprised. Because he understood exactly what that sentence meant coming from me. Not gossip. Not reassurance. Documentation. The original deck files? Yes. The annotated investor bios? Yes. The first-year bridge loan memos? Yes. He exhaled once. All right. I stood, carried my untouched glass of water to the sink, poured it out, and watched the stream vanish down the drain while the gala continued silently on my phone behind me. Somewhere inside that glass conservatory, under warm light and applause, my husband was standing on a stage built partly out of my work and publicly pretending that the woman beside him had shaped the voice of a company whose earliest survival had depended on me being willing to become voiceless in all the right places. That part was over. I walked upstairs, unzipped the navy dress from the garment bag, and put it back in the closet. Then I changed into black slacks, a cream silk blouse, and the long charcoal coat I wore when I needed to remember what my body felt like inside authority instead of injury. I tied my hair back, took off my wedding rings, put them in the top drawer of my desk without ceremony. That, more than anything else, calmed me. Not because I was ending something dramatically. Because I was finally removing 2 small pieces of metal from a roll that had already been made decorative in public. My mother called at 7:41. I answered on the first ring. Are you going there? June asked. No preamble. No sympathy. She knew me too well for that. No, I said. Good. I thought I heard her not say, what are you doing instead? I looked down at the legal pad I had already pulled toward me. On it, in my own handwriting, 3 words. Authorship. Equity. Record. I'm making sure, I said. That if he wants a stage, he gets the right script. Silence. Then, very softly, the nearest my mother ever comes to open approval. All right. That was my retreat. Not collapse. Not surrender. Repositioning. I spent the next hour doing what I should have done months earlier, reading with malice removed. Once you take hope out of a paper trail, the truth gets cleaner. The founder acknowledgement deck had indeed been altered. My name had not merely been omitted, prior embedded comments referencing my edits, timeline corrections, and authorship notes had been stripped in the final exported version. Sloppy. Not enough to destroy evidence, but enough to prove intent. Leonard's documents started arriving in batches. The first-year payroll memo with my signature. The bridge loan note backed by my condo. The revised investor pitch where my tracked changes still sat like fossils under Grant's now polished language. The advisory minutes listing me as operations architect during the company's second restructuring. And then the one that truly settled me. The original nomination file for the Founder Recognition Award. Not submitted by Grant. Not drafted by Daphne. Prepared 8 months earlier by Leonard's office using internal company history. Archived investor correspondence. And legacy materials. Under critical early contributors. My name appeared first. Selene Mercer, co-strategist, informative operational survival period. Co-strategist. There it was. Not wife. Not support system. Not early spouse presence. Co-strategist. I sat back in the chair and felt, for the first time that night, something sturdier than fury. Ground. The Gala feed cut to Grant at the podium then, accepting applause with one hand lightly resting against the acrylic stand. Daphne at stage left in gold light like a polished translation of my disappearance. I unmuted just in time to hear him say, "No one gets here alone." But at a certain point you realize vision has to harden into leadership. I almost laughed. That line used to be mine. Not verbatim. Better than that. It was the cleaned-up bastard child of 3 different sentences I'd once said over takeout cartons in our first office when he was spiraling over a delayed trial, and I was trying to explain why charisma alone wasn't going to carry us through another quarter. There he was, wearing my thought in a tuxedo, while telling the room I wasn't presentable enough to sit in it. Good. Let him keep talking. Let him keep borrowing. He still didn't know the one thing men like Grant always forget in the moment they start believing the polished version of themselves. The person who built the machinery remembers where every hidden lever is. Adopt. Szejsprezecie. I texted Leonard. I want the original founder file delivered to the board chair tonight. And I want the metadata report sent to every member of the recognition committee before the after-party begins. He replied in under a minute. Understood. That was my silence. That was my withdrawal. Not passive. Not wounded. Not waiting at home while he shone. I was no longer competing for a seat in the room. I was rearranging what the room would know by the time dessert was served. And somewhere between the muted applause and the cold lamplight over my kitchen table, I realized something that made the rest of the night almost peaceful. He had excluded me from the event. He had not excluded me from the truth. The first layer of truth was authorship. Not memory. Not sacrifice. Not marriage. Authorship. That distinction mattered more than I can explain. Because if I had gone into this fight as the wounded wife, Grant would have had room to sentimentalize me. He could have looked pained, grateful, complicated. He could have let Daphne smooth the edges and call the whole thing a difficult personal transition during a critical growth phase. Men like Grant survive scandals by reframing women as emotional weather around their destiny. But if I went in as an author, a builder, a documented strategic force in the company's formative years, if I went in with records, drafts, in the bettering Sixter, tracked changes, bridge notes, metadata, and formal nomination history, then he had a different problem entirely. Not optics. Record. Leonard Pike understood that immediately. By 8, 32 pram. M. My inbox held a folder titled Founding Materials Mercer Contributions. He hadn't dramatized it. Of course not. Leonard was too good for that. The file said arrived the way truth should arrive when it means to survive. Time-stamped. Boring looking. And devastating if read by anyone with authority. I opened the first document. A payroll bridge memo from year 1. Grant's handwriting was barely legible in the margins, full of exclamation points and panic. But the transfer authorization beneath it was mine. My account. My signature. My note to the bank manager requesting short-term personal liquidity to cover company payroll after our lead investor delayed funding. The next document was the warehouse lease. Not signed by husband and wife. Negotiated by Celine Mercer. The next, a track changes version of our first viable investor deck. Grant had supplied the voice. I won't lie about that. He always had the outer layer, the velocity, the charisma, the founder's pulse. But underneath his bullet points and visionary nonsense was my structure. My red lines, my caution, my corrected burn rate, my revised runway timeline, my removal of 2 absurd product promises he would absolutely have made in public if left unsupervised. Then came the advisory minutes. That one almost made me laugh, because there, in dead legal prose, sat the version of me he had spent years trying to airbrush out of the company's origin story. Celine Mercer, to assume temporary strategic operations oversight until revenue stabilization. Temporary. Funny word. Temporary labor by women is one of the most permanent forces in the world. Companies get built on it. Families too. Then, once everyone is comfortable enough, they rename it support and ask why the woman seems so attached to being remembered accurately. The next file was the Founder Award nomination packet. That one was cleaner. Deadlier. The original nomination, as Leonard had told me, listed me under critical early contributors. But it went further than that. Under Material Forces in Survival Stage Execution. The narrative section credited me by full name with restructuring supplier risk, preserving investor confidence during the second quarter withdrawal crisis, and co-developing the company's workable operating model during its first 18 months. Co-developing. Not decorating. Not emotional support. Not founder's wife. Co-developing. That was the phrase I sat with longest, because it was the language of truth before branding got involved. Before Daphne. Before the board started preferring the polished mythology of a self-made man over the messier, more common reality that women often build the floor while men take the keynote. Then Leonard sent the metadata report. That was where the real rot showed itself. The current founder deck, the one looping on screen at the Gala, had been altered from earlier internal versions in 3 distinct stages. The first edits removed references to household-backed liquidity events. The second stripped my name from contributor notes. The third revised language around the survival years to center Grant as singular architect of vision, operational clarity, and early resilience. Operational clarity. I had to stop and put my hand flat on the table when I read that phrase. Because it was too exact a theft. Not generic flattery. Not harmless rewriting. He had taken the very thing I had spent 11 years providing clarity and assigned it to himself in a polished public archive. It should have hurt. Instead, something steadier happened. I stopped doubting the scale. That's what documentation does for women who have been diminished in elegant ways. It removes the part where you waste time asking whether you are overreacting. Whether maybe he didn't mean it like that. Whether perhaps this was just optics. Or stress. Or some transitional ugliness that can still be folded back into marriage if handled with enough restraint. No. He knew exactly what he was doing. And Daphne knew too. Her edits were all over the internal comms drafts Leonard forwarded next. Not obvious. Not sloppy. Just strategic enough to reveal intent. Phrases like refining founder narrative, reducing non-essential peripheral acknowledgments, aligning all public-facing material around singular leadership identity. Singular leadership identity. There it was. That was the second layer of truth. This had never only been about my dress. my body, my age, my hair, or whether I looked polished enough to stand beside him under donor lighting. The presentable comment had merely been the emotional weapon. The deeper move was structural. He was not trying to protect the room from me. He was trying to protect the lie from my presence. Because if I attended, people who had known us from year one might remember too much. They might see my face and connect it to the warehouse, the deck revisions, the investor dinners in cheap restaurants. The two crises Grant still described in interviews as lonely founder seasons, even though I had been sitting across from him with spreadsheets and bridge terms both times. My absence was useful. That was the third layer. Not accidental. Not neglectful. Useful. Once I understood that fully, the humiliation changed shape. It stopped being a wound and became evidence. And evidence, if handled correctly, does not need to cry. It needs to arrive. I looked up then at the muted live stream still playing on my phone. Grant was on stage now. Daphne, near the wings. The board smiling. The room warm with money and selective memory. They still thought they were celebrating a founder story. What they didn't know yet was that the missing author had the original drafts, the signatures, the metadata, and a very good lawyer. And once a woman like me stops trying to be graceful about being erased, a lot of polished rooms discover how fragile their narratives really are. The panic started with the board chair. Not Grant. That's how I knew the night had already slipped beyond branding and into consequence. Adopt. Patruzet Shishap de Place. M. Leonard forwarded confirmation that the original founder file, the metadata report, and the early-stage contribution documents had been delivered to the recognition committee and copied to Harold Baines, the board chair. Harold was 70. Careful. Old school. And allergic to embarrassment when it arrived through governance rather than gossip. He didn't scare easily. But he hated one thing more than scandal: revisionist heroics built on falsified records. That mattered, because up to that point, Grant could still tell himself this was a domestic upset. A wife feeling sidelined. A husband making hard image decisions. Daphne would know how to smooth that. She always did. She spoke fluent institutional euphemism. She could turn betrayal into positioning, erasure into streamlining, and humiliation into alignment. But if Harold Baines started reading files while Grant was still on stage accepting gratitude for a founder story edited into fiction, then the room would stop being social. It would become evidentiary. I unmuted the live stream again just as Grant finished the polished middle of his speech, the section where he thanked the people who understood the mission early. A sentence so artfully empty it should have been engraved on his tombstone. He smiled. The audience smiled. Daphne stood off to the side with her hands lightly clasped, wearing the face of a woman who thinks control is permanent because tonight's lighting flatters her. Then I saw it. Harold leaning toward Leonard at table 4. Not casually. Not socially. With documents open. That was the beginning. Grant kept talking. Of course he did. Men like him never notice collapse at first because they are too busy hearing their own amplified voice. But down on the floor, something had started changing. One committee member stopped clapping. Another looked at the side screens and then back at her folder. Leonard, bless him, didn't even glance toward the stage. He just turned another page and slid a copy across the table. The camera cut wider. I watched Daphne notice it first. That was interesting. Her face didn't change immediately, but her body did. A slight shift in the shoulders. The hands unclasping. Eyes flicking not toward Grant, but toward Harold. Then toward Leonard. Then to the side stage event manager. That was when I knew she had sensed the narrative slipping. Good. Let her feel it before she understands it. My phone buzzed. A text from Leonard. Harold has questions. Recognition packet was not the version he approved. There it was. Not suspicion. Not discomfort. Questions. The cleanest form of institutional danger. I typed back, "Has he seen the original acknowledgement language?" 3 dots. Then, "Yes. He's asking who removed it." Beautiful. Back on the live stream. Grant had moved into the final section of the speech. The triumph language. The inevitable founder language. The part where he always widened his stance slightly, lowered his voice, and delivered ambition, as if he'd invented adversity, personally. He never got to finish it. A woman from the event team stepped onto the side stage and said something to Daphne. Daphne's face went white. Not dramatically. Just enough. Then she crossed behind the podium and murmured something into Grant's ear. He froze for half a second. There. That tiny break in rhythm. Most of the audience wouldn't have noticed it consciously. But I did. Because after 11 years, I knew exactly what Grant looked like when control left the room before he did. He recovered outwardly. Barely. "Excuse me," he said into the mic with a smile too fixed to survive replay. "It seems I need to clarify something with the committee." Clarify. Interesting word. Men choose when they're already in trouble. He stepped off the stage. The applause was uncertain now. Not absent. Worse. Polite. Confused. Fragmented. The camera followed poorly as he moved toward table 4, which made the whole thing feel even more naked. People at neighboring tables were no longer pretending disinterest. Heads turned. A donor couple actually stopped mid-conversation to watch. Daphne reached Harold first, leaned in, and began speaking with the smooth urgency of a woman trying to reseal a narrative before the men around it admit they've been handled. Then Harold stood up. That was the escalation. Not shouting. Not public accusations. The board chair standing at a founder recognition gala with documents in his hand while the honored founder leaned toward him in visible tension. The room felt it instantly. I could tell even through the bad event audio. Grant tried the contained version of outrage first. The executive one. Jaw tight. Smile gone. Posture still attempting dignity. He reached for the folder Harold was holding. Harold did not let go. That was when Grant's face changed. Panic. Properly born. Is such an ugly little thing in ambitious men. It arrives looking offended. Then insulted. Then suddenly very young. Daphne spoke again too quickly. Too close. Too much with her hands. I couldn't hear the words. But I didn't need to. Her body was already confessing for her. Not innocence. Damage control. That particular brand of professional fear that only comes when the room has begun suspecting not just a mistake, but manipulation. Another text from Leonard arrived. Harold just asked. In front of 3 directors. Why Celine Mercer was removed from the founder materials? Daphne said it was a comms refinement. Harold asked who authorized history refinement. I laughed then. Actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was exact. History refinement. That was the kind of phrase only a communications woman in real trouble would choose while standing in the wreckage of her own polish. The live stream camera cut back to the stage, where the MC was trying to stall with an improvised anecdote about innovation and resilience. Nobody was listening. All the attention remained down on the floor where Grant, Daphne, Harold, Leonard, and now 2 members of the recognition committee stood in an increasingly rigid little circle. Then came the detail I will never forget. Harold looked up from the documents, scanned the room once, and said something that made one of the committee women turn toward the side screen displaying Grant's founder timeline. She picked up the remote. The timeline disappeared. Just like that. Gone. The polished story. The self-built montage. The airbrushed myth. Removed in real time, while the audience still held dessert forks and donor smiles. That was when Grant fully understood he was no longer managing a marriage problem. He was losing authorship in public. And once a man like that realizes the room may soon learn that the woman he called unpresentable is the one who made him legible in the first place. Panic stops being internal. It starts radiating. The reveal happened because Harold Baines refused to let them take it backstage. That was the difference between embarrassment and collapse. If he had pulled Grant and Daphne into some side room, if he had protected the donors from discomfort and the board from awkwardness, the lie might still have survived in the way polished lies often do. It would have been handled, reframed. An unfortunate omission, a communications oversight, a legacy materials issue. Grant would have gotten to keep his face. Daphne would have kept the gown and the posture and maybe even the job for another quarter. But Harold was too old and too rich for that kind of cowardice. He understood something most people in powerful rooms forget. If a founder story is false in public, the correction must also be public, or it becomes just another favor men do for each other. So, when the side screens went black and the MC's voice started trembling through some improvised filler, Harold did not move this off the floor. He took the microphone. The camera jolted once, then found him standing at table 4, with the founder packet in one hand and the altered timeline deck in the other. The room quieted in the fast, frightened way expensive rooms do. When they sense a script they paid for is being replaced by the truth. Grant looked like a man trying not to sweat in front of people who had once admired him for seeming frictionless. Daphne stood half a step behind him, which told me everything. She was already repositioning, already trying not to be the closest body to the blast. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harold said, voice dry and perfectly steady. "Before we continue, there appears to be a material correction that must be made to the founder record being presented tonight." There it was. Not misunderstanding. Not concern. Material correction. My phone was suddenly too hot in my hand. The camera cut to Grant's face for a second, and I saw it plainly now. Not anger. Not charm. Not managerial control. Fear. Raw. Unlit fear. Harold lifted the packet slightly. The version of the company history shown this evening differs from the nomination and archival materials reviewed by the Recognition Committee. Specifically, the omission of Ms. Celine Mercer from critical early-stage operational credit is not supported by the underlying record. The room changed. You could feel it even through the live stream. A soft ripple first, then stillness. Then the kind of silence people fall into when they realize they have been participating in someone else's vanity structure without consenting to it knowingly. Grant stepped forward, one hand half lifted, and I knew that gesture. It was his emergency charisma move, the one he used when investors got nervous, and he needed to look like the adult in the room. "Harold," he said, smiling too fast. "With respect, this is a communications issue. Not something we need to—" Harold didn't even turn toward him fully. "Sit down, Grant." That was the moment the room chose. Not because Harold was loud. Because he was authoritative in a register Grant could never imitate, unimpressed. Grant didn't sit. Worse, he froze, because being publicly told to sit down like a misbehaving junior in front of donors, press, board members, and the very woman who had helped package his myth well. That's the kind of humiliation men like him never believe can happen until it already has. Harold continued. Ms. Mercer's early contributions include payroll preservation, operational restructuring, supplier stabilization, financing bridge support, and documented co-development of the company's workable execution model. He was reading from the original file now. My file. My work. Not my marriage. Not my sacrifices. Not the wounded wife version of the story Grant might still have survived. The record. Leonard texted me as Harold spoke. He's using the nomination language directly. Daphne looks like she may faint. Good. Let her feel the oxygen leave. Then Harold said the sentence that finished it. It is the view of this board that if a founder is to be recognized publicly, the factual architecture of that founder's survival years must also be recognized accurately. Factual architecture. I had to sit down. Not because I was weak. Because something in me went loose all at once. 11 years of being softened, blurred, translated into support. Wife. History. Background. Domestic climate. And suddenly here was the cleanest man in the room, using structural language for what I had been. Architecture. Grant tried again. You're making this into something personal. No, Harold said. You did that when you altered authorship. Jesus. Even through the terrible event audio. That one landed like stone. The camera cut wide. People were no longer pretending not to look. A donor woman in emerald silk had set her glass down midair and forgotten to pick it back up. Two members of the recognition committee were openly reading from the original packet now. One of the earlier investors, someone I remembered from the lasagna at my kitchen table years, was staring at Grant with the particular disgust of a man who has just realized the founder story he funded has been cosmetically masculinized. Then came the public correction. Harold turned toward the AV team and said, "Restore the original acknowledgement slide." A beat. Then the side screens came back to life. No glossy timeline this time. No self-built montage. No cleaned-up founder myth, just text on black. Critical early contributors. Celine Mercer, Strategic Operations. Payroll Preservation. Early financing support. Foundational execution model. Leonard Pike, Founding Counsel. Initial advisory group archival record attached. My own name appeared 20 feet high behind the stage where Grant had stood 5 minutes earlier, accepting applause for a history edited to remove me. That was the reveal. Not that I had helped. That I had been foundational. That the woman he called unpresentable enough to attend was written into the architecture of the company more deeply than the communications woman in the champagne gown. More durably than the speech he was trying to salvage. And more truthfully than the version of himself he had been performing all night. Daphne said something, then I couldn't hear it. But I saw the shape of the plea in her mouth. Grant turned on her. Not dramatically. Worse than that. With the cold, panicked fury of a man who suddenly realizes the person he used to polish a lie may now be the nearest available body to blame. Too late. The room had already seen the screens. Seen the packet. Seen Harold refusing to soften it. Seen Grant's public recognition transformed into public correction. And somewhere inside that glass conservatory, beneath the orchids and donor lighting and all the expensive little mechanisms of celebration, my husband finally learned the one thing he never understood about women like me. You can exclude us from the room. You cannot exclude us from the record. Grant's collapse did not happen all at once. That's what made it satisfying. If Harold had simply denounced him, if the board had yanked the microphone, and security had escorted him out, while the donors gasped into their champagne, Grant might still have found a way to romanticize it later. Men like him are perversely good at turning dramatic failure into mythology. He would have called it a misunderstanding. A hostile overreaction. Proof that success makes people jealous and marriage complicated. No. What happened to him was much worse. The room stopped believing in him by degrees. That is how powerful men truly fall. First, the applause died. Not fully. Some people still clapped out of reflex when Harold finished speaking. Because wealthy rooms are often a beat behind their own moral intelligence. But the rhythm was wrong. Thin. Fragmented. It sounded like politeness trying to escape a mistake. Then the tables stopped looking at the stage and started looking at the documents. That was the real shift. A founder can survive whispers. He can survive scandal if it stays emotional. He can even survive infidelity if the room decides it was merely personal weakness dressed in tuxedo lighting. But once the room starts reading, once the people with money and memory begin comparing the performance to the record, charisma stops functioning. Grant tried to speak again. That was his first real mistake after the reveal. He stepped toward Harold, hand half lifted in that old practiced gesture of his calm. Reassuring. Slightly burdened by the need to restore order on behalf of everyone else. I had watched that gesture close investors, soothe suppliers, and talk employees out of reasonable panic for over a decade. It no longer worked. With respect, he said into the mic Harold had not yet lowered. Celine's contributions were always appreciated privately. But this event is about founder leadership, not operational support. Operational support. I actually said the words out loud to my empty kitchen. Because there it was. Even then. Even while the documents were open. Even while my name stood on the side screens in white letters against black. Even while Harold Baines and Leonard Pike were holding proof that I had not merely supported his little vision but actively preserved its survival when he would have crashed it into the ground on confidence alone still. Grant could not stop reducing me into something adjacent. That sentence killed him more cleanly than any accusation ever could have. You could see it happen. Not in Harold. Harold was already done with him. In the room, in the donor woman, with the emerald dress, who slowly set her napkin down and leaned back as if distance could correct her previous admiration. In the investor from year one who stopped looking amused and started looking embarrassed. Which is much worse. In the younger board members who had probably built half their idea of Grant Holloway from company lore and were now discovering the lore had been aggressively masculinized. And in Daphne. Especially Daphne. She moved too quickly then. Stepping toward the mic with a smile so brittle it could have cut glass. What Grant means, she said, is that we may have streamlined certain references for narrative coherence. Narrative coherence. Jesus. That phrase should have ended her career on the spot. Not because it was inaccurate. Because it was too accurate. She had just publicly admitted to streamlining a living woman out of origin. Harold turned to her slowly. Did you remove her name? He asked. Daphne Froza. That was the moment I stopped seeing her as dangerous and started seeing her as finished. Not because she had no talent. She did. Too much of the wrong kind. But rooms like that forgive ambition only when it flatters their ethics. The second ambition starts tampering with record, especially under the nose of old men who still believe authorship should at least pretend to matter. The aesthetic turns toxic. Daphne glanced at Grant. That glance finished both of them. Because it showed the room where authority had actually been. Not in communications. Not in some harmless branding choice. In his approval. Grant saw it too late and tried to cut her off. This is not the time. No. Harold said. This time into the microphone. It's exactly the time. Then he did something even worse than public correction. He asked Leonard to read. Leonard Pike rose with the original founder packet in his hand and the kind of expression lawyers wear when they have stopped being privately useful and become publicly precise. He read 3 excerpts. The payroll bridge memo. The operations oversight minutes. The founder nomination language naming me as co-strategist in the company's formative survival period. No commentary. No moral flourish. Just the record. When he finished, the room had gone so quiet I could hear the Gala's air conditioning through the live stream. That silence made Grant look small. He was still in black tie. Still handsome in the expensive, market-tested way that had once persuaded rooms to call him visionary before checking whether the work underneath him matched the shine. But now he looked what he had always secretly been afraid of becoming. A man whose success, once stripped of the woman-shaped labor beneath it, might not have been sturdy enough to deserve the story built around it. He tried anger next. Of course he did. This is humiliating, he snapped. There it was. Not gratitude. Not correction. Not even denial. Really. Just grievance at being publicly measured against truth. Harold did not blink. Yes, he said. For the right person. That line hit even through the screen. And then came the final collapse. Not from Grant. From the event itself. The recognition committee chair, an older woman named Eloise March, whom I knew only distantly from 2 prior donor luncheons, walked to the stage. Took the commemorative glass award from the podium pedestal. And set it down on the table instead of handing it to him. That tiny movement told the room everything. He had not merely been corrected. He was no longer being honored. You could feel the donors reorganizing themselves around it. Conversations had stopped. Smiles were gone. The event planners were pretending to manage logistics while clearly listening harder than anyone. The founder's reel never came back on the screens. The band didn't resume. Even the waitstaff seemed to understand that dinner service had crossed into witness territory. Grant looked around for anyone to restore the fiction. Daphne wouldn't meet his eyes. Beautiful, because that was the real punishment for men like him. Not losing the applause. Losing the accomplice. Then Leonard texted me one final update before the live stream cut to a wide holding shot of the room. Recognition suspended. Board wants immediate review of all founder materials and comms approvals. Grant is asking to handle this privately. Harold refused. Of course he did. He wanted privacy now. After telling me I wasn't presentable enough to attend, after building a whole evening on my absence, after letting another woman glow at his side while my work was dressed up as his singular leadership. No. He did not get privacy. He got proportion, and as the camera held on the shattered little geometry of the room, Harold standing. Leonard seated. Eloise at the stage. Daphne pale. Grant isolated in the center of an event that had been designed to glorify him. I realized something almost tender in its accuracy. For 11 years, I had carried the parts of him that failed under pressure. Tonight, in public, he was finally standing without me. And everyone could see exactly how little remained. The first thing I got back was not the company. It was the language. That mattered more than I expected. For 11 years, the words around me had been shrinking. Not loudly. Not enough for anyone to call it abuse if they only heard one sentence at a time. But steadily. Efficiently. In the way professional men and polished women do when they want to remove a person from authorship without triggering open resistance. I had gone from strategist to support. From co-builder to spouse. From operational architect to someone who was there in the early days. From necessary to sentimental. And then, finally, to not presentable enough. That is how erasure works when it can afford nice lighting. So when Harold Baines stood in that room and used the phrase factual architecture, when Leonard Pike read my role into the microphone without apology, when the side screens restored my name in white against black, and no one could call it emotional because the evidence was already in everyone's hands. Something inside me straightened in a way no revenge fantasy ever could have given me. I was no longer asking to be seen. The record had started doing it for me. My phone buzzed at 9:31. Grant. Of course. I stared at his name for a full ring before answering. He didn't greet me. That told me everything. No, Celine softened by regret. No, can we talk? Wrapped in faux respectability. No attempt to sound wounded, or complex, or privately burdened by the public mess he had personally staged into existence. He went straight to damage. What exactly are you trying to do? He demanded. I almost laughed. Because there it was, the oldest male instinct in the world. A woman gets publicly restored after being quietly erased. And the man who did the erasing still hears consequence as aggression. What am I trying to do? I repeated. Yes. He snapped. You sent Leonard after me with archival junk in the middle of a live event. You made me look insane. No. That was the beautiful part. I hadn't made him look anything. I had merely removed the edits. And men who build themselves partly out of omission always call the restored version a distortion. I walked out to the back terrace while he spoke. The night air was cooler there. The garden lights were on. Somewhere beyond the hedge line, a dog barked once and stopped. The ordinary world continued. Which felt right. His humiliation was enormous to him. To the universe. It was paperwork catching up. Grant. I said, very calmly. You told me I wasn't presentable enough to attend a ceremony for a company I helped build. Then you stood under donor lights and accepted praise from a version of history that had been professionally stripped of me. If the truth made you look insane, perhaps the problem was the lie. He was silent for one beat too long. Then, lower. You're overplaying this. No. I was naming it at scale for the first time. And the thing about scale is that once a woman stops minimizing her own contribution to keep a man emotionally habitable, a lot of rooms suddenly have to recalculate. I'm not overplaying anything, I said. I'm correcting authorship. That shut him up. Because beneath all his vanity, Grant knew language. He knew what words could do when chosen correctly. He'd built half his later success on that fact alone. Correction was not marital. It was institutional. Authorship was not emotional. It was structural. That meant he could no longer drag me back into the domestic theater where he had the advantage. This was bigger now. Or rather, more accurate. He tried one last pivot. Do you know what this is going to cost me? There it was. Not what he had cost me. What this would cost him. I looked down at the wedding rings, still sitting in the top drawer of my desk inside the house behind me. Placed there hours earlier without ceremony. And felt the last of the pity go out of me. Yes, I said. Not as much as it cost me to build you. Then I hung up. That was the moment I took my name back completely. Not because hanging up on a man is powerful by itself. Sometimes it's petty. Sometimes it's avoidance. Sometimes it's just a phone call ending. But this call mattered because, for the first time in 11 years, I was not managing his emotional experience of the truth. I was letting him have it raw. My mother arrived 15 minutes later. June Mercer came in through the side gate with no coat. No apology for the hour. And one of those faces women of her generation wear when they are trying very hard not to say, "I warned you," because your pain has finally become larger than their vindication. She found me at the kitchen table with the live stream paused on a frame of the black acknowledgement slide still carrying my name. She looked at the screen, then at me, and said, simply, "There you are." That almost undid me. Not because it was tender. Though it was. Because it was exact. There you are. Not "I'm sorry." Not "what a bastard." Not "you should have been there." There you are. As if I had been returning slowly for years, and tonight the room had finally stopped interrupting the process. We sat together after that in the kitchen where I had once corrected investor bios at midnight, and packed conference itineraries, and drafted thank you notes, and proofed his speeches while he slept like men sleep when they are confident someone else is carrying the unseen parts. My mother poured wine. I didn't cry. That mattered too. Not because tears would have made me weak, but because I wasn't broken in the way the night had been designed to break me. Grant had expected exclusion to reduce me. Daphne had expected absence to finish the edit. The board had expected a clean founder narrative they could applaud without investigating its missing architecture. Instead, by the end of the night, my name had re-entered the company publicly. My role had been read into the record. The recognition had stalled under the weight of truth. And the one woman deemed too unpresentable to attend had become the factual center of the event anyway. I had not reclaimed a husband. I had reclaimed proportion. And once a woman has that back, the rest of the room starts learning how to address her correctly. 6 months later, my name was back in the company history. Not as a courtesy. Not as a wife. Not buried in some sentimental footnote about early support. Properly. The board's final archival correction listed me as foundational strategy and operations contributor, survival stage architect, an early financing support lead. Dry language. Precise language. The kind of language that does not flatter anyone. Which is why I trusted it. Truth gets safer when it stops trying to sound beautiful. Grant hated every word of it. That was not the best part. The best part was that he could do absolutely nothing about it. The recognition gala was never reissued. Harold Baines refused. The board review widened once the founder materials were audited. And what looked at first like one ugly act of personal erasure turned out to be exactly what I suspected it was: a pattern. Revised origin language. Selective omissions. Internal decks that gradually shifted singular credit toward Grant while flattening everyone else into atmosphere. Daphne did not survive the quarter. Not because I demanded it. I didn't have to. Once a communications executive gets publicly tied to history refinement, wealthy boards stop hearing polish and start hearing liability. Grant remained CEO for 3 more months. Then he stepped aside to focus on strategic transition. That line made me laugh for a week. Because for 11 years, I had been the one focusing on strategic transition, bridging cash flow, correcting investor language, reworking timelines, preserving payroll, and translating his panic into leadership before anyone else smelled smoke. He got to use that phrase on the way down because men like him always borrow one last sentence from the women they diminished. It did not save him. The market did not implode. The company did not collapse. That was important too. Men like Grant often believe that if they fall, the structure must fall with them. Because otherwise, they would have to face the possibility that they were never the sole pillar they performed themselves to be. But Holloway Biosystems kept operating. Quietly. Competently. Better. In some ways. Once the mythology stopped getting in the way of record, Leonard Pike joined the interim governance task force. Harold remained exactly as unimpressed as God intended. And me? The strangest part was that I did not want his chair. People asked. Of course. Not directly at first. Wealthy people never begin directly when they're trying to assess a woman's appetite after public correction. They circle. They compliment your poise. They mention your intelligence as if they've just discovered it in the light of a man's disgrace. They ask whether you'll be more involved going forward, which is their way of wondering whether you mean to convert moral vindication into formal power. I considered it, then declined. Not because I was weak. Because I finally understood the difference between reclamation and re-entry. I did not need to inherit the room that had erased me in order to prove I existed there. I needed the record corrected, the authorship restored, and the proportion returned. Once I had that, I was no longer interested in sitting under the same lighting that had once found me too inconvenient to display. So I built something else. A consulting arm. Small at first, then not small at all. Quiet work. Operations triage. Founder stage structure for companies still dumb enough to think charisma can substitute for systems. I worked with women first, then with anyone coachable enough to understand that the glamorous part of a business usually rests on 10 ugly, unphotographed things somebody serious is maintaining in the dark. June called it revenge in sensible shoes. She meant it as a joke. It wasn't one. Grant called twice during those 6 months. The first time, angry. The second time, careful. The careful call was worse. That was the one where he said, I know I mishandled things. Mishandled. As if I had been a communications object. As if the problem was not that he had spent years metabolizing my labor into his identity and then tried to exclude my body from the celebration of its results. I let him finish. Then I said, No. You understood exactly what you were doing. You just thought the room would let you keep it. He had no answer for that. Because it was true. That is the final shape of the story. I think, not that a cruel husband got embarrassed, not that a communications woman in an expensive gown learned history has claws, not even that a board discovered it had been applauding edited masculinity under donor lights. It is this. I spent 11 years building his success. And when he decided I was no longer presentable enough to attend the public celebration of that success, he accidentally forced the truth into the open. He turned a long private diminishment into a visible lie. He made the correction necessary. Public. Documented. Clean. He thought exclusion would make me smaller. Instead, it made me legible. These days, when I walk into rooms tied to that old chapter of my life, people use my name correctly. Not warmly. Always. Not with guilt. Sometimes with caution. Sometimes with real respect. Sometimes with the uncomfortable clarity people reserve for women they once underestimated and now must address at scale. That's enough. More than enough. Because the truest ending was never going to be getting him back. Or taking his title. Or standing at the gala in the navy dress after all, while donors watched him squirm. The truest ending is quieter. It's this. He is now permanently attached to a corrected record. And I am no longer attached to his version of my importance. The room knows who built what. The archive knows who wrote what. The company knows who kept it alive long enough for it to have a history worth falsifying. And I know something I should have known years earlier. A woman does not become unpresentable because a man grows ashamed of the labor that made him visible. He becomes smaller because he tried to stand in public without properly naming the hands that held him up. That was the new order. Not forgiveness. Not reunion. Not even justice in the dramatic sense. Just truth. Finally wearing its own name.